Welcome to Conversations with Consequences here on EWTN Radio. I'm your hostess, Betsy Fentress.
And I'm Mary Fiorito.
And we're glad to have Edward Pentin with us today, the senior Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Register, known for his fine reporting and analysis. And as we remember Pope Francis this week, after his tragic and sudden passing on Easter Monday, we not only want to get his take on the life and legacy of the first Latin American Pope, but also look into who might succeed Pope Francis. Welcome back to the show, Edward.
Hi, good to be with you both.
So you've covered pontificates now for several years. What strikes you most about the Francis pontificate?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, it was a complete outlier in the sense that it was very different to the pontificates of John Paul and Benedict XVI, who I also covered. John Paul, not so much, of course, just the end of that one. But it was very, very different. It was disruptive, I could say. That's probably the best word to say it. It was very unsettling for a lot of the faithful who followed him closely. But at the same time, that bore some fruit. We can talk about that in a bit. But it was very much a sort of stirring up of the church, which really did need stirring up in a sense. There were a lot of problems, a lot of divisions under the surface, which really came to the surface under Francis' pontificate. And I think in the long run, I mean, who knows? It's not for me to say, but I think it's probably going to be seen as positive in that sense. And it'll be up to the next pope to make good of that.
Mm. So, Edward, this is the first papal funeral for a sitting pope that we have seen since John Paul II passed away, because, of course, Benedict resigned. So that was a very different kind of conclave. There was a rather unique relationship there between Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. What can you share about their friendship, and was there any mentoring involved in those early years? What was that like?
Yes, I mean, they were very close in that sense. And a lot of course, the theology of John Paul came from Cardinal Ratzinger, and they were close collaborators for a long time, and I think had a great complementarity with each other. I think there was a bit of frustration. I seem to remember reporting on this, that they were frustrated about how, even though they were putting across good Orthodox theology, the numbers didn't really match, and the decline of the faith continued. But I think on the whole, it was a very good team effort. And I think that's always been kind of crucial, I think, with pontificates, that the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, now the dicastery, that they get on well with the current pope and they work well together. And I think that all helps the strength of the Church, the strength of the Vatican.
So we will bury the Holy Father on Saturday, and then there will be a conclave. And we know that there are a lot of rumors swirling around about who might be the next pope. And you have put together an amazing website, the collegeofcardinalsreport.com. Could you tell us about that? And then we'd like to go through who you think some of the most strong candidates are, as best as anybody can guess, for the next chair of Peter.
Sure. Well, this website really developed from a book I wrote with a team of researchers back in 2020, which was called The Next Pope and the 19 Leading Cardinal Candidates. And we really just put that together because, and it's the same reason why we did the site as well, was because the cardinals don't know each other very well at all. And that's partly because since 2014, Pope Francis stopped regular meetings with them. They used to come for cardinal-making consistories, and they'd all meet together. But those meetings, those consistories ended then. And so there are very few opportunities for them to meet each other. In fact, I think they only met once in a consistory since that time. And so that's one reason. The other reason is that the Pope Francis also chose cardinals from the peripheries and from countries that don't normally have cardinalatial sees. And so they came from unknown places. They were unknown bishops often. And again, they weren't known at all by each other. And so there was a real need, and it was a requested need, to create, first of all, the book. And then in order to update the book and expand it, we turned it into a website. And that's now called the collegeofcardinalsreport.com, which is accessible to anybody. And you can go and see all the profiles of the different cardinal candidates. We have, I think, 42 in-depth profiles now of the leading cardinal candidates. And we just wanted it to be a lasting resource, really, for the cardinals, so that they know who to choose for and really make an informed choice in the conclave. we tried to also make it simple. We had a where they stand section, so you can quickly see where they stand on different issues, and hopefully give a good all-round picture of who they are and where they stand.
Yeah, well, it's an incredibly helpful resource that really wouldn't have been even possible to do back when John Paul II passed away. And so thank you for
Right.
doing it. One of the questions that, of course, American media will always ask is it possible for there to be an American Pope? And a lot of people are talking about Cardinal Prevost, who was an Augustinian who is from Chicago, but spent much of his ministry life in Peru. If you're asked that question as a non-American yourself, how would you generally respond to it?
Well, yes, I mean it's a given rule, a sort of unspoken rule that a cardinal from a superpower is not elected. It hasn't been the case, I think, since the 18th, 17th, or 18th century, when of course there were the papal states and everything, and the papacy was a lot more political in that sense, and so there was always that sort of rule that you couldn't have that sort of concentration of power with the superpower and the papacy. But I think that could easily be broken. It depends, of course, on the candidate and those voting, but I don't think they're going to sort of have that as a definite no-no to say you can't vote for an American because of that. And in fact, I think there could be an argument to say that it could be beneficial. I think there's possibly a need for an American cardinal to be a bridge between, say, the Trump administration and the current hierarchy, because there are differences between them. Um, and I think if there were a cardinal candidate who was respected, perhaps by the Trump administration, that could be a very, very good bridge between the church and the United States at this current time. So I think there's certainly strong arguments for an American pontiff, and yeah, I don't rule it out. At least when I look at the sort of analysis of it, very easily. I think it's quite possible.
How big of a factor do you think age plays when people are considering the next pope?
I think it's quite significant because it's uh, it's it depends if they want somebody to be like a caretaker pontiff, they will obviously go for somebody quite a bit older. But if they want somebody who could be a big reformer, somebody who could really change the course of the church and make a huge impact, they'll go for somebody younger. And I think at the moment, I don't know, of course, but I think one can just speculate that they'll want possibly a fairly short pontificate, somebody just to bring a certain calmness back to the church after these rather tumultuous pontificate of Pope Francis. So, but yeah, it certainly is a big factor. Yeah.
Edward, this morning on social media, there were a number of photos of Cardinal Sarah and uh, Cardinal Burke going into a meeting together. And they seem to be two favorites of a lot of people. Of course, they would be on the conservative end of the spectrum. But Cardinal Sarah is said to represent this block of African cardinals. How influential will that group be at the next conclave?
I think it'd be quite significant. I think the African church is obviously growing very fast, and they have in Cardinal Sarah, they have a very respected candidate there. In fact, his candidacy is very interesting because he is to turn 80 in June, and so he's only just going to make this conclave, be able to vote in it, and possibly be elected himself. So that could be a sign of providence, perhaps. But it is interesting that he is certainly as a strong candidate. But yes, I think it is quite possible that you could have an African uh, Pope elected, and also because the Pope has, as we know, has chosen many candidates from the global South, who will want somebody probably from the developing world, somebody to represent their interests, not just from Africa, but from the whole of the developing world. And so that adds also to the possibility, the quite a real possibility of an African Pope, I think, in the future. Yeah.
Can you go through some of the people who you think are the leading contenders? And maybe let's go ahead and just start with Italy, since you might know some of these cardinals personally from all of your reporting there.
Yes. Well, there are. I think the Italian candidates are quite significant, and I think there's a good chance that they could be elected simply because the Italians had the papacy for 450 years up until John Paul II, and so if they want to bring back a certain calmness and continuity with the Church of the past, that could happen. And there are several candidates. We have Cardinal Pietro Parolin, of course, the Secretary of State, who is a strong candidate, has a lot of criticisms as well about him, mainly because of his lead in the China negotiations with the Vatican, which are very controversial. And he's been Secretary of State now for 12 years, so he's been one of the longest serving officials of Pope Francis' pontificate. And then there's another strong candidate in the Italian Church, who is Father Gian Pierbattista Pizzaballa, who's the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. And he's a very strong candidate in the sense that he's a good administrator. He's very respected by all sides. He's a Franciscan friar. Running against him is the fact that he's quite young. He'll be 60. He's just turned 60, in fact, which is also quite young for in Vatican years, as we say. And he is, but he is a strong candidate. I think he's somebody who is sort of certainly up and coming. And if he isn't elected in this conclave, he could be in the future. Yeah.
Edward, what do you think about among the Europeans? Cardinal Peter Erdo's name comes up frequently. Is he too conservative, do you think, for some of the more progressive cardinals in the conclave?
I don't think so. I think he has a lot of strengths in the terms of canon law. He'd be somebody they might choose in order to sort of right the ship after Francis, because Pope Francis sort of overrode quite a lot of canon law, and I think that concerns a lot of people. Certainly a concern of Cardinal George Pell and others. And they wanted a pope who's going to bring the church back to a more law-abiding church and faithful to apostolic tradition. So I think he would be strong in that sense. One of his weaknesses, though, I think, for Cardinal Erdo is that he tends to be rather risk-averse. I don't think he'd take many risks. I think he's rather cautious, and maybe considered too cautious by some. So I think that's possibly the case. I don't know. I don't think he'd be considered too conservative by anybody.
What about other Europeans, Edward?
So other Europeans, well, I think you have. I think there's certainly some in Eastern Europe who are considered quite orthodox, although some of them they've now over 80, like Cardinal Duca, who is of the Czech Republic. But there are others who are quite strong. I think, but most of them, I think, would be in Italy. And we've got there's also Cardinal Eijk of Holland, of Utrecht.
Right. I was going to ask about him.
Yes, he's considered a very strong candidate in the sense that he's very pro-life. He's very faithful to the church's teaching. He's somebody who would be very, very helpful to bring a certain calmness back to the church, bring the church back to a more orthodox pope, somebody who's going to be very faithful to apostolic tradition. He's a former medical doctor, and he brings a lot of experience in dealing with secularism. He had to deal with quite a lot of opposition when he was bishop, with opposition from the homosexual community, who he had to stand up against, and it actually made him quite sick. So he's been through quite a lot of suffering for that, and I think he'll be considered somebody who be very solid, strong candidate. Yeah, somebody who's going to be a very strong pope in the face of secularist forces, I would say.
Edward, an adjective you've used several times now through this conversation has been calmness, bringing back someone who will bring back a sense of calmness and order, I guess, to the papacy. And Pope Francis has not been without controversy, and I often think of what Thomas Aquinas is said to have stated, which is grace builds on nature, and nature in this case happens to be a very kind of fiery South American
Right.
person. That's just his temperament. It's just how God made him. But he does tend to say things without a lot of theological precision. What else would you say contributed to this sort of, chaotic might be too strong a word, but a less than structured environment at the Holy See for the last 12 years.
Yes, well, I think it wasn't just his teaching, it was also his governance, his mode of governance. And he was rather autocratic. I mean, he did rule with an iron fist, and it was very difficult to work with him. For many people in the Vatican, they're very demoralized. There was a sense that there was a lot of fear. Um, and fear was sort of injected into the sort of daily life in the Vatican. Um, there's a lot of sort of lack of trust, I think, and there's a lot of arbitrariness too in his governance. He was often talking about a god of surprises. Well, he was also the author of surprises himself, and I think that took a lot of people off guard. And I think it was difficult. I think it was difficult for quite a few people to work with him. Um, I mean, that's not to say he didn't have some very good points as well, in terms of he was very pastoral with a lot of the people he worked for as well, and so forth. But if he liked somebody, if he would be he would show a lot of favoritism to them, even if they might be quite different ideologically with him.
Hmm.
So you never knew quite where you stood with him, and he also valued a lot personal loyalty with his friends, and not not at all with his who he could perceive as enemies. So it was a very difficult time really to work with him for a lot of the officials in the Vatican.
So you said earlier that he quit calling the cardinals to the Vatican regularly. Given that he appointed these people from some of the lesser populated parts of the world, why would he do that?
Um, yes, well, I think he wanted to really. It's all part of his outreach to those who are marginalized and not included. And there was a lot of discussion during Benedict's pontificate about how Eurocentric it was, and how it was too Western oriented and too focused on the European history and civilization, as it were, and they wanted a far broader, internationalized curia and a college of cardinals. And so I think that's what he was planning to do. That's why he very much emphasized that.
I that part I understand. What I don't understand is, given that, why he called the cardinals to the Vatican less regularly. That was the part that confused me.
Oh, right, yes. Well, I think that was nobody knows for sure, but it happened right after the synod and the family, which was very controversial, and it caused a lot of opposition. And we had the dubia as well, which caused a lot of controversy. And I think he was concerned that if the cardinals all met, they could gang up against him and confront him with a lot of the perceived errors in his teaching. And so that was a theory put across by several cardinals who said this, not necessarily publicly, but that's a strong theory that's why he decided to do that. So yeah, it was a controversial decision, but it had quite a lot of repercussions, I think.
Edward, one of the things that this particular papacy has been best known for is a word that I don't think any of us had ever heard before Pope Francis, and that's synodality. And we had
Right.
these synods where people of all vocations in the church came together to talk about particular issues. I think there was, I think, some effort on behalf of some to try to work in that blessing for same-sex couples, and also the female diaconate, issues like that. And, I have a friend who pastors an inner city parish in Chicago, and he's the only person there. He's a solo pastor, and, he hears 10 hours of confessions a week. He has to say mass in 3 languages. And he said to me, I know that Pope Francis cares about the people that I'm ministering to here, the very poor people who are struggling. If I asked
Mm.
one of them what a synod was, they wouldn't know what a synod was if I if it came up and hit them over the head, it will have,
Right.
he was very frustrated. He said, if we are to be a church that's going to really try to minister to the poor and help them, I don't understand why we're spending so much time and money on this synod. What do you think the going forward is going to happen to this synodality and synod? And is this something that will die with this pope, or do you think it'll be picked up and carried on in the future?
Well, yes, it's a good question, because I think a lot of the cardinals, certainly when we're putting together this report, a lot of the new cardinals, many of those that Pope Francis chose, are greatly in favor of synodality, and they make a point of mentioning it. Now, whether that's because they truly believe it and know what it's about, or whether they were just concerned, trying to curry favor with the pontificate, it's hard to say. But you're right; it's something that a lot of people don't really grasp, and it's difficult to grasp because no definition has really been given that's sort of satisfactory. I mean, the way I see it is that it's basically a sort of democratization of the church, and a way of trying to sort of make the church more of a church of the people, rather than the hierarchy, but which has its own problems. And of course, there's a lot of criticism about that it's undermining the church's hierarchy, in doing so. But the Pope, you see, he put himself across as a man of the people. He talked very much about the theology of the people, and that all plays into this. But I think also it wasn't just his idea. It was really an idea that came, I think, largely from Cardinal Martini, who, as we know, was a Jesuit, very much a dissenting cardinal, heterodox leaning. And he saw it, I think, as a way of trying to get into the church a lot of his heterodoxy and a lot of his thinking on different issues which were considered heterodox and not accepted by the main body of the church. And so I think a lot of people see now that the synodality is seen as a democratization of the church, but at the same time, quite possibly as a vehicle for bringing in those sort of heterodox ideas. And so it'll be interesting to see if the next pope really understands that and sees it like that, or whether he'll see it obviously as a totally sort of benevolent thing and something that really could bear good fruit and keep it going. We'll have to see, I think.
We have time for one more quick question, and that is Cardinal Zen has sounded the alarm on some things being moved up this week. Can you tell us about this and what the concerns are?
Well, it's about starting the general congregations today. Well, on Tuesday, which is just the day after the Pope's death. And I think there's concerns that the general congregations, when all the cardinals are supposed to meet to discuss the future of the church, it's premature to start them now because, well, mainly because most of the cardinals aren't in Rome yet. They haven't had time to get to Rome.
I see.
And so there's concerns that some of the cardinals are going to start sort of jockeying and maneuvering and before everyone's arrived. And so, but as I understand it, I mean, I think these first meetings are really preliminary, just to discuss basic sort of organization issues regarding the funeral and the conclave, and the real discussions about the future of the church begin on Monday. So I think it's probably not such a concern, but it is a bit odd, though, to start it quite so soon, I think.
Well, politics will continue as always, and we all need to be praying. Edward, thank you so much for joining us. And listeners, catch all of his writings at the National Catholic Register by visiting ncregister.com. And if you're interested in checking out this amazing new website ahead of the upcoming conclave, please visit collegeofcardinalsreport.com. Thank you so much for joining us, Edward.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Please visit thecatholicassociation.org to follow everything we do in radio, TV, print, online in our local communities. I'm here with my co-host, one of my co-hosts, Ashley McGuire, and we're sitting here reflecting on the death of our Holy Father, Pope Francis. And I've asked Ashley to share thoughts that she posted on her Facebook page that really captured some of the range of emotions that she had when she heard about the death of Pope Francis. Ashley, tell our listeners about that.
Well, first of all, I think like everybody, I was really shocked. It was very shocking news because we all saw him just hours before in St. Peter's Square, greeting people, giving a blessing, going into the crowd. And, his health has been frail, but he had seemed to be improving. But speaking of his health, the thing that I was really struck by was his last weeks on earth. And we live in a culture where, the elderly are kind of stuffed away. We don't see them. Euthanasia is on the march across Europe and even in the United States. And Pope Francis, from the beginning of his pontificacy, really focused on the elderly. He made sure to always include them when he talked about the marginalized. And that was really the first time I thought about the elderly as marginalized in the same way as the disabled, the poor, the unborn, because to our culture, they're not considered useful anymore, which is so tragic. But he himself allowed himself to be elderly before the world. He didn't hide. He came out and made appearances, in his weakened state, and especially that time that he came through with his Argentinian poncho, kind of like almost like a comfort, like you would expect from somebody who's really elderly and nearing the end of his life. So I thought it was just such a beautiful witness that he was witnessing to something that he himself had made a centerpiece of his own papacy, and then he lived that out. He died with true dignity, and I think in turn really showed us how to live.
I agree. I mean, he allowed the whole world in on those last painful weeks. You and another one of our co-hosts, Mary Fiorito, are going to Rome. You'll be reporting from Rome. You've been to a conclave before. You must be really excited to get over there.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. I feel so blessed to be able to go. As you say, I went to the 2013 conclave where Pope Francis was elected Pope, and that was another shock. His name was not at the top of anybody's list. So, I think it's going to be an unpredictable conclave, but an exciting one. And we know at the end of the day that the Holy Spirit is in charge. And so I think as Catholics, we just need to really pray that God's will be done for the future of his church.
We'll be joining you in praying, and we'll be really looking forward to all of your reporting and missives. And stay right here on Conversations with Consequences, and we will be connecting with Ashley and Mary from Rome. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Betsy.
Welcome to Conversations with Consequences on EWTN Radio. I'm your hostess, Betsy Fentress.
And I'm Mary Fiorito.
And we're happy to have Msgr Roger Landry with us, a member of our TCA team and our resident chaplain. Msgr, we're so lucky to have you, especially this week, as millions of Catholics across the globe are mourning the death of Pope Francis. He died Easter Monday after a bout of double pneumonia left him in the hospital for 5 weeks. We were touched by his very few public appearances the last couple of weeks, including Palm Sunday and even yesterday, Easter Sunday, for their Urbi et Orbi. Can you tell us how you see the legacy of our dear Pope Francis?
Well, there are various aspects of his legacy. One is he was elected because of a speech he had given 6 days before March 13th, 2013, as he came out as the 266th Peter. He said that the next pope, little did he know that it would be he, needed to be one who, from his contemplation and adoration of Jesus, would go out to the peripheries. And I think that those words characterized his end. It was clear that his doctors wanted him to stay put in the Domus Sancta Marta, where he was living, but he just couldn't stay there. Mm-hmm. He was coming into the basilica, he was coming to greet people in St. Peter's Square, and that he began his papacy in the Loggia of Blessing, and he finished his papacy, in a sense, with his last public appearance, giving his blessing from that same loggia, was a beautiful inclusion. And for me, the very fact that God the Father allowed him to remain Pope through Easter, so that his sort of last greeting would be Happy Easter, a real profession of trust in the resurrection and what it means for us individually, as well as on the third day of the novena for divine mercy, and mercy was so key for his pontificate. That was beautiful, and he died on what the Italians call La Pasquetta, the little Easter, Easter Monday, we would call it in the U.S., which is basically treated as the Easter holiday, the overflow of Easter Sunday. What great timing God has in calling those who have sought to bring others to him back home to the house where the Pope's boss had gone to prepare a place for Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis, and has gone to prepare a place for us if only we respond to God's mercy the same way Pope Francis tried to encourage us to do so.
Monsignor, the last words of the Urbi et Orbi for this year are really profound. And as Cardinal Dolan said this morning, you couldn't have scripted a more perfect passing of the Pope, other than the way it happened, to die on Easter Monday after giving his blessing, to all those pilgrims on Easter Sunday. But these last words of the Urbi et Orbi, he fills us with the certainty that we too are called to share in the life that knows no end. Let us entrust ourselves to him, for he alone can make all things new. Happy Easter, everyone. And you just think of him, as you point out, I was saying to another interviewer I was speaking with this morning that, how Aquinas said grace builds on nature. And nature, in this case, is a very stubborn South American man who really had to power through. But my goodness, he did it, didn't he? And to leave us, though, all of us, with this, I'm not afraid of where I'm going. I know I'm going to a merciful and loving Father.
He was one tough hombre. And he was one whose whole life was one of faith. I mean, you don't leave the world there in Buenos Aires and become a Jesuit religious and a priest and continue to follow Jesus through suffering and continue to work so hard at 88 years old, so far past ordinary retirement age in most other areas, not even just someone with the duties of the church throughout the world on his shoulders. But Pope Francis himself was juiced. I mean, he got so much of his energy from a living relationship with Jesus risen from the dead. And so he was giving witness to that faith, which he exuded through everything that he did. He was giving witness to that faith in his last words. And what a beautiful valedictory. The Pope, as vicar of Christ on earth, is not supposed to be the star. He's supposed to be closer to the moon than the sun, which is what he said to the cardinals who elected him 6 days before they did so, that the church is the mystery of the moon, reflecting Christ, the Son of Justice's radiance. And that he was doing that in his last words, wow, would that God give us the same grace to be able to go out praising the Lord and entrusting ourselves to the power that he has over sin and death, raising us to new life forever. That's the type of happy death that someone who added St. Joseph to every Eucharistic prayer deserves.
Wow. So wouldn't you say that the one word that will really be associated with him is mercy, Monsignor? And I wanted to refer to an article that you wrote in the National Catholic Register on a papacy rooted in God's mercy. And you write about a passage that really moved you. Excuse me. For me, he said, feeling oneself a sinner is one of the most beautiful things that can happen if it leads to the ultimate consequences. When a person becomes conscious that he is a sinner and is saved by Jesus, he discovers the greatest thing in life, that there is someone who loves him profoundly, who gave his life for him. And I guess if you think that you're operating from a position that you're a sinner, then the one thing you want is mercy, right?
Yeah, and he said when he was asked by Father Antonio Spadaro in his first of what became over 70 major interviews with the secular press, that when he looks at himself and says, who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio? He says, a sinner looked upon with love by the Lord. So he recognized how much he needed the Lord, but that the Lord was always responding with his mercy to our misery. His very papal motto was, the Lord, having looked on him with mercy, chose him. That's what miserando atque elegendo means. And so his own papal election, he understood within the context of the mercy of the Lord. And for me with Pope Francis, he echoed some words of St. John Paul II. John Paul II said, we're living in a kairos of mercy. Now, there are two Greek words for time. One is chronos. We get chronology from it. It's tick-tock, 1 minute to the next. Chronos basically means an opportune occasion. It's a time, in a sense, when time stops. And he says, we're living in a kairos, an opportune time of mercy, where God's mercy is abundant. And Pope Francis received that gift earlier today on Easter Monday, when mercy incarnate, his boss, Jesus Christ, came to embrace him. We pray forever. The whole church now is praying 9 days as we're entrusting the Holy Father to mercy of God. Jesus told us not to judge anybody. So we're not going to condemn somebody and put him to hell. We're not going to canonize somebody and put him automatically in heaven. But we do know that Pope Francis trusted in Jesus' mercy and wanted all of us to trust in that mercy. And that type of hope will never be in vain.
And I think that's where some people misunderstood him, Monsignor, because he wanted everyone to know, that's his whole todos, todos, todos. Everyone is welcome to come into the Father's house, but obviously on the Father's terms, right? And it's Jesus's church, not our church, and not the church of our making. So sometimes that could get confusing for people to understand. He didn't want anyone to think that God's mercy and love were not available to them because of their, sexual orientation or whatever, issue someone might be facing that put them at contradiction with church teaching. But the Vatican has now, we have a little bit of breaking news, just released Pope Francis's personal direction for his tomb. It includes the following instruction: the tomb must be in the earth, simple, without special adornment, and with only the inscription Franciscus. So even in death, he's
Simple.
living as simply as he tried to in life.
Simple, and for the rest of his life. I'd like to just circle back to that first point, though, that you said, which he was always making a contrast between sinners and what he called corrupt. He said all of us except Jesus and Mary are sinners. But there's a difference. A sinner recognizes he or she is a sinner and comes to the Lord for mercy. Somebody who's corrupt says, okay, this is what I'm doing, but doesn't change. And he used one of his famous phrases that person's like varnished putrefaction. That person is like one of these pieces of wood that are now thousands of years old because they've ceased having life. And what he wanted to do is he wanted everybody to open themselves up. While he was welcoming them in the name of the Lord, he wanted to get them to welcome the Lord Jesus with his call, going back to his first words at the shore of the River Jordan: repent and believe in the gospel. He was always calling us to conversion and calling us to a life of faith. And so there was a double welcoming going on. He wants all sinners to have trust that the Lord Jesus, who looked at Pope Francis with love, looks at us with love, but that love is a demanding love on the part of Jesus. And it's something that leads us to pluck out eyes and chop off hands or chop off feet if they lead us to sin. And so when Pope Francis, for example, in Latin America, had said, who am I to judge? When the journalist asked him afterward, he said, listen, I'm not saying that what this Vatican Monsignor, who was caught in the very act of same-sex activity, I'm not saying that isn't wrong. But if somebody turns to the Lord and asks for his mercy, how can we refuse it? Because that's essentially what St. Peter himself did when he said to Jesus, when Jesus called him from his fishing boats, depart from me, O Lord, for I'm a sinful man. We have to recognize how much we need that mercy. And that will be, as we were talking about before, I hope, the great legacy of Pope Francis, that he has led. He's consolidated the work of St. John Paul II about divine mercy in the church, and he's particularly wanted us to lead with mercy, not lead with judgment, not lead with conversion, but lead with God's mercy that can provoke a conversion, because now we're not doing it for the wrong reasons, but we're changing our behavior because we know that we're loved, and if we're loved that much by God, we too can change.
Don't you think that this message is getting through to young people? Our Easter Mass yesterday was packed in a way I haven't seen it in 20 years. And the New York Post had a piece about how young people are coming back to the church. There must be something about this notion of mercy that is drawing people in.
Mercy is part of it, but I likewise think that one of the major things is our young people have grown on up without God. They've grown up in a secular circumstance in which so many people have robbed them of the greatest treasure any human being can receive, which
It's
is the
true.
gift of God. And so they're looking, where's God? And when they start surveying what the alternatives are out there, they recognize that the most credible proposal of God's being present with us in the world is the Christian proposal. And when they start to look at the various ways that that Christian proposal is articulated today, I think they find the Catholic version of it the most compelling. And so that's why, like in the fall, I had 35 students at Columbia in my OCIA program. That's why so many OCIA programs on college campuses are now setting records, because people are busting down the doors wanting to get on in. Pope Francis was part of that, but the biggest part of that, I think, is the attraction of Jesus Christ that never loses its luster, and the work of the Holy Spirit, who is tugging at the threads of people, but also putting in their paths Christians who really take our faith seriously. And that compelling synthesis in a human life is something that communicates to them, I want what that person has. This person has 46 chromosomes just like I do, and yet this person's happier, dealing with the same pressures that I'm under. How can I get a piece of that? And so they're starting to follow us as we try to follow Jesus.
Monsignor, this Sunday is Divine Mercy Sunday and was to be the canonization of Blessed Carlos Acutis. I understand more than 300,000 tickets are out there for that particular event, which is now going to be postponed, obviously. What will happen now for this Divine Mercy Sunday? Will the funeral, do you think, be Friday or Saturday, and then the church will celebrate Divine Mercy Sunday, or will the celebration be muted somehow because of the Holy Father's passing?
So we don't, as of this very moment, know when the funeral is going to be. My hunch is that it's going to be Saturday, but on Sunday, they're still going to have the big mass. It's not going to be a canonization, but it's going to be a Jubilee Mass. And then they've got several other things of the Jubilee of young people coming to Rome, that they're going to have this way of light that was already scheduled. They're going to have several things that were scheduled for the Jubilee. And so that's still going to occur because so many are coming to Rome. But we're likewise going to see just how young the church is, as those young people are going to be waiting in line to be able to pay their respects for the Holy Father. And I hope they're going to be present for the funeral of the 266th Peter, because Pope Francis kept that tradition of World Youth Day. He tried to propose the gospel to the young. And I think that they're coming to Rome to pray with the Catholics all throughout the world for Pope Francis and ultimately for whoever will be St. Peter 267. I think that will give the whole world a tremendous witness that when we talk about the Catholic Church, we're not talking about yesteryear, we're talking about today and tomorrow, because God with us is still very much with us, and he wants us with him in the present.
So we lay Pope Francis to rest, and then can you go through the procedures for the next couple of weeks for our listeners on how we will come to elect the next pope?
So we begin with 9 days of mourning, and the funeral is pretty much in the midpoint of that, between days 4 and 6 after his death. So we'll have 9 days of masses. And then we will start what's called the general congregations, in which all the cardinals, both those under 80 who will elect the next pope, as well as those over 80 who won't be able to participate in the conclave, but they can still share their insights about what the church needs and the characteristics of the next pope that the church needs. And so there'll be at least 4 days of that. It could be extended. And then after that, there'll be the conclave, in which there'll be a mass in the morning, and then they'll have the first 2 ballots at night in the Sistine Chapel. And then every day thereafter, there'll be 2 cycles of 2 ballots every day. And if there's not somebody who gets a 2/3 majority of the cardinal electors, we'll have black smoke from the Sistine Chapel. And if somebody gets 2/3 plus 1, then we'll have the white smoke. And I hope everybody will be watching EWTN, as I'll be doing the call of who the next Holy Father is and what name that he chooses. And so that's pretty much what we're looking at. So the conclave is probably going to start in about 2 weeks. And then most people are going to think it's going to be longer than the conclaves that would have elected Pope Benedict in 2005 and Pope Francis in 2013, because the cardinals who are voting aren't going to know each other quite as well as the cardinals did in the last two conclaves. And they probably aren't going to know the person for whom they're going to be casting their ballots nearly as well. So it's probably going to be more than the 4 ballots that it took for Pope Francis, even though they had to do a 5th because there was an extra blank ballot in there, even though he had more than 2/3 plus 1. So it's probably going to take several days. And so all of us throughout the church, first, we need to be praying for the eternal repose of Pope Francis. We do that for 9 days. Let's not look too far ahead. But after the 9 days of mourning, then we start to pray for whoever's going to have the heavy burden of carrying on the legacy of St. Peter all the way down through St. John Paul II, through Pope Benedict, and through Pope Francis. That is a massive responsibility for the world, and we need to be praying for that person to cooperate with the Holy Spirit to be able to give us what the church really needs.
Monsignor, one of the commentaries I've seen this morning suggests that the Holy Father will not be buried at St. Peter's, where his predecessors are, but rather at Santa Maria Maggiore, or St. Mary Major, because he has a particular devotion to an icon of Our Lady that is housed there. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
That's true. He has put clearly in his will that he, unlike 149 of his predecessors who have been buried in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, he's chosen to be elected over at St. Mary Major, where several of his predecessors are. You've got Pope St. Pius V, who's buried over there. Pope VI is the 5th in history. He was the guy who built the extra chapels there. But when he went into the conclave in 1585, it's one of the great stories that they knew that everybody was looking for a quick papacy. So he was brought in on a stretcher. He thought that he was the Pope that Rome needed. He was brought in a stretcher as if he'd have a very short papacy. And as soon as he was elected, he got on up as if he had received a miracle. And he reigned for 6 years and really reformed Rome after the scandals of the 1500s. He's likewise buried there. And so Pope Francis had a great love for Our Lady in general, but particularly that image of Our Lady, Salus Populi Romani, we call her, health or salvation of the Roman people. And that image is at least 1,500 years old. We have record that St. Gregory the Great, who was Pope from 590 to 604, one day when a fire was destroying the Vatican, came to get that image, and he processed with that image all the way around where the fire was in the Borgo section close to the Vatican. And that image extinguished the fire. And so that's where it got the reputation of being the salvation of the Roman people against these types of things. So Pope Francis, before and after every international trip, would go over and pray before that image of Our Lady. He brought that image over to St. Peter's on several occasions to be able to pray before her with all the people coming to the masses. And I think super touchingly, as soon as he was released from the Gemelli Hospital, even though he was too sick to get out of his wheelchair and go into the basilica, he at least brought her flowers. And then when he got a little bit better, one of the first things he did when he left the Domus was to go over to Mary Major. We know that Pope Francis, just like we do, has plenty of images of Our Lady in his room there at the Domus Sancta Mater. He has that great image of Our Lady on Door of Knots. But his love for Our Lady led him to inconvenience himself in that way in order to be able to go over there. And what a great witness he teaches us, right? We've prayed so many thousands of times, Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. And he was always asking Our Lady to pray for him right then, and then to pray for him too at the hour of his death. And little did he know that it would be at 7:35 a.m. Rome time on April 21st, 2025. But Our Lady, no question, the salvation of the Roman people and the salvation of the Roman pontiff was praying for him at that very moment, that he would be able to come to the eternal right side of the blessed fruit of her womb, whom Pope Francis served as his vicar on earth for over 12 years.
That's really beautiful. I want to go back, Monsignor, to something you said about how a lot of these cardinals might not know each other. Didn't he appoint quite a few cardinals that come from parts of the world that are far-flung from Rome, shall we say?
Yes, he really internationalized the College of Cardinals, but likewise, he chose a lot from the peripheries. Last week, I spoke for 2 hours with Cardinal Giorgio Marengo of Mongolia. He has fewer than 2,000 Catholics in Mongolia, and yet he was appointed a cardinal in his late 40s. Now he's just past 50 on the human odometer. But like lots of people like Cardinal Marengo, a 42-year-old Ukrainian bishop in Australia, was likewise named a cardinal. Pope Francis did not call the cardinals to Rome as much as his predecessors did. And generally, when they would get together for what we call consistories, they'd have a chance to have dinner together, to talk during coffee breaks, to really get to know each other, to practice various languages, so that they'd be able to do their duty of saying, does this guy have it to be the successor of St. Peter? So that really hasn't happened as much as previous papacies. And so that's why these days for the funeral and then the meetings called the General Congregation and then the deliberations, everything else are going to be even more important in 2025 than they were in 2013 and 2005. So these guys are going to first have to introduce themselves to the other cardinals in case one of them might be the one that the Holy Spirit would love to see made number 267. But then likewise, they're not just going to take somebody else's recommendation in terms of who would be a good successor of St. Peter. They've got a duty to try to get to know some of the papabile, we call them, those who are eligible to be elected to the, or sort of likely to be elected to the papacy. They've got to do their own due diligence there to say, I think that this guy would be a good pope or not. And so there's going to be a great get to know you session coming on up over the course of this week and next.
I was just going to ask, are they sort of quarantined, for lack of a better word, so that they're in close quarters with each other?
So they're all going to be living together at the Doma Sancta Mater, which is exactly where Pope Francis lived. That was built specifically for the conclave. Other people can live there when there's not a conclave, but it was built for there. They'll all move in there at least by the time of the general congregations, the meetings of cardinals. They'll still be totally free to come and go as they please.
I see.
In the past, they've tried to discourage the cardinals from giving lots of media interviews during that time period, lest certain people try to sway the election is the overall idea of why they do that. But once they have the Mass, the morning of the first election, they will be sequestered totally in the Doma Sancta Mater, and then they'll be in buses all the way over to the Sistine Chapel and back every day. And so it's at that point where they won't have their cell phones. All their windows will be nailed shut so that they can't open or get signals, and all of the other people who will be interacting, including those cooking food and you name it, they'll all be under an oath to keep strict confidentiality during those time periods, not to pass messages, you name it, from the time that the first day of the conclave takes place. Up until then, they'll be as free as you and I.
And Monsignor, I think a lot of people don't realize that those days before they go into the conclave are so critical, because there's no horse trading and talking once they get in there, because it's a liturgical act. And it's very beautiful to watch the individual cardinals going in, taking that oath, and then walking into the Sistine Chapel. These are things, that happen once a decade, maybe. Kind of once in a generation for a lot of people. If you had to advise our listeners on what should you really carve time out of your schedule to make sure that you don't miss, what would you say? There's a lot to choose from, but what do you think is really critically important?
So I would say keep your own schedule in terms of praying every day for the Holy Father until we have the time for his funeral Mass. Right? Once his funeral's set on up, for those in America, the funeral's probably going to begin at 4:30 in the morning Eastern time, 1:30 a.m. Pacific time. But just like we do for midnight Mass, I'd encourage you to change your schedule to get up and pray for that. That would be the first thing. And then once the conclave happens, people should be ready at about noon every day and about 6:15 p.m. every day Rome. Sorry. So that'll be 6 a.m. and about 12:15 p.m. East Coast time to just turn on EWTN and see whether it's black smoke or white smoke. And if it's white smoke, then all of a sudden get sick from whatever else you were doing to be able to watch it live for the next hour. But every day there'll be 2 votes in the morning, 2 votes in the afternoon. And generally they're going to give us the news of what happened inside by that ancient tradition of smoke at about 12:15 Rome time, or 6:15 a.m. New York time, and 6 hours later for the afternoon ballot. Those would be the ways that I'd calibrate an internal clock.
Well, Monsignor, we are out of time, but we're looking forward to hearing from you from Rome, for the center of all the action, and hearing you on EWTN. Mary Fiorito will be there, as well as Ashley McGuire, and I'm looking forward to talking with them across the pond. To learn more about Monsignor Roger Landry, please visit CatholicPreaching.com. And to learn more about the Catholic Association and everything we do, go to CatholicAssociation.org. Monsignor, it was a pleasure to have you, and thank you for being here.
God bless Betsy. God bless Mary.